On count one, the racketeering conspiracy charge, Sean Combs has been found not guilty of racketeering conspiracy, perhaps the most complicated charge for the jury to understand. And we have a not guilty now on count two, which was sex trafficking of Cassandra Ventura. Sean Combs has been found not guilty of sex trafficking when it comes to his former girlfriend, Cassie Ventura. There was a real debate that the jury heard over the course of the last 2 months about consent and coercion and the complications of deciding when an 11-year relationship between Combs and Cassie Ventura may have become a criminal one. And the jury decided it was not criminal sex trafficking.
Welcome to At Least You Heard It Here, with your host, former federal prosecutor, Alyse Adamson. Take it away, Alyse.
He beat it. Not guilty of the three most serious charges in the Sean P. Diddy Combs case. What at first seemed like an insurmountable hurdle, well, it looks like the defense pulled a rabbit out of their hat, because Sean Combs could be going home in as little as 2 years. And hi, welcome to another episode of At Least You Heard It Here. I'm your host, Alyse Adamson, and this is the podcast where we put the topic of the day on trial. And of course, our topic today is a trial, and it is the conclusion of my coverage of the Sean P. Diddy Combs trial. I went back and forth about whether or not I would do a final video. I think this is something like my third or fourth on this topic. And I said ultimately yes, because we talked a lot about it. And the end, the conclusion, was dramatic, but at the same time, unsurprising. See, because this was a novel use of the RICO statute. And I understand why prosecutors did it. And they did it because a lot of the underlying crimes that the jury was being asked to consider as that predicate acts for the racketeering charge is that pattern of criminal conduct that they had to consider: the arson, the kidnapping, the bribery. These were all crimes that Combs could not be charged with independently. And that's because the statute of limitations on those crimes had run. And what statute of limitations means essentially is that prosecutors have a certain amount of years to bring a case after a crime has been committed, and then they can't anymore. And of course, the notable exception of that is murder. There's no statute of limitation on murder. But I think what this trial demonstrated to me is that we need to be enlarging the time for a statute of limitations in certain contexts. I argue, especially in the context of domestic violence, because victims oftentimes don't disclose right away. And we understood that in this case, there was a lot of reasons that Cassie Ventura did not come forward. There was economic pressure. There was actual physical abuse, threats. She was scared. And then women in a lot of other circumstances, or victims in a lot of other circumstances, don't feel like they can come forward, or they have a trauma bond with their abuser. They identify with their abuser. They're in love with their abuser. They don't want their abuser to get in trouble. I saw that a lot when I was a prosecutor and I was working in the domestic violence section. So there's lots of reasons why there is delayed disclosure. And then at a time when a victim feels strong enough or safe enough to tell their story, they're told the time has elapsed. And so I think what happened here is you had a man who had a pattern of criminal activity, criminal conduct. Some of it was pretty easy to prove: the violence, we had the video, the briberies, but couldn't prosecute them on their own. And that's the reason that we have statutes with look backs. And the RICO statute was a tool in the prosecutor's toolbox that could sweep in some of that conduct and could bring Mr. Combs to justice. And it was a novel use. Some people are calling it an overcharge. I think we need to be careful. When we say overcharge, a lot of times the context behind that is that it was a reach, that the government just wanted to pin somebody, that they threw the book at somebody, the harshest charge they possibly can, even though the evidence was weak. And I don't think that was the intent behind this charge. I think it was a real attempt to charge the conduct that they were seeing, which was a pattern of criminal activity. He was using employees to do his bidding, to do criminal acts. And the RICO statute seemed like it was the best fit in a very limited set of tools. Now, that being said, the best fit, but not a great fit. And I think that's what we saw with this acquittal. I think there was also a huge problem when it came to this RICO, and that is that the RICO is obviously related to a corrupt enterprise. And in an enterprise, you really need to have a structure. I think the jury had a hard time understanding this Combs enterprise where people were acting with a unified purpose when the only people the prosecution offered as witnesses were low-level employees who they themselves were under a lot of duress. I mean, creating reasonable doubt. And I think what was hard for me is this was the Southern District of New York who brought this case. They are known to be the cream of the crop. These are amazing attorneys. And so I was questioning my own questions about the wisdom of talking about somebody like KK, for instance, very close to Combs, and trying to place her in the center of this conspiracy with him, but not offering her as a witness. Same with D-Rock and other people in his inner orbit we heard about, but weren't actual witnesses. And there are a lot of reasons why these folks probably didn't testify. And we could sit here and speculate they could have had their own exposure, or the prosecution thought they might be just as harmful as they were helpful, whatever. But they tried to backdoor this theory of a sophisticated organization where there were high-level people who were acting with the same purpose as Combs without offering them up. They're trying to try their case with missing pieces, even if there's a valid reason for the pieces to be missing. You have to look at the case and say, can we make this charge without them? And so I think that's where I see that I kind of diverge from other people thinking this was an overcharge. I think in certain contexts, even given these facts, they might have been able to make out that RICO. I think given the evidence that they had available to them, it ended up being very weak. And I always said, technically, they met all the elements of the offense, technically, but it wasn't enough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. And there were other things they could have done to shore that up, or maybe they just didn't have it, in which case they should have thought twice about bringing the charge. Now, the sex trafficking charge is also, hard for me to accept. I mean, I accept the jury's verdict and I understand why they found the way they did. But Cassie especially, let's just talk about Cassie. This woman was a victim. And there's a lot of hot takes out there right now that this was a transactional relationship, that Cassie loved Diddy, agreeing with the defense's theory that this was just domestic violence. There is never just domestic violence. She's a victim. She's an abuse victim. So people that are out there saying she gained from this relationship, there was no victimhood here, disagree. I think it is very clear that this woman was under this man's control. The problem, just like the RICO, is that human trafficking, sex trafficking, the fact pattern that's really contemplated behind that charge is different. This was a long-standing relationship, and there is this line between consent and coercion. When did it become coercion? And the elements that had to be met, again, I think were technically met, but they didn't quite fit this situation. I do think that Cassie was coerced. But again, the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. And when the defense attacked Cassie the way that they did, with her own text demonstrating that she was consenting in some situations, she was a willing participant in other situations, and she did love Combs, it was very hard for a jury who has not spent time with domestic violence victims, like I have, like a lot of other people have, to understand why, even on a single occasion, it was completely coercive and she couldn't say no. Which again begs the question, understanding how that would be difficult for a jury to find should they have brought that charge. Now, they did offer the psychologist to try to explain the psychology behind victimhood, and clearly that wasn't enough. The jury, and then there's a take that the jury just didn't believe Cassie. It could be that they didn't believe her. I mean, they chose not to credit her testimony in its entirety, but it could have been that they just weren't convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. And there's a difference between totally disbelieving someone and feeling like the government did not meet their burden because there wasn't that extra independent corroboration and there was all of those confusing texts. So it's unfortunate that there isn't a charge that more neatly fit the abuse that Cassie suffered, because it is more than domestic violence. This was a kind of sexual violence, abuse, and one that could be prosecuted years later. Again, that's that problem, that statute of limitation on a lot of those other charges that could have been proven here. So where I land, folks, is that I think the government's heart was in the right place. When you're a prosecutor, you want to do justice. You want to step in the shoes of the victims and you want to deliver justice on their behalf. You want to hold defendants, wrongdoers, people who have committed criminal offenses, who have victimized people. You want to hold them accountable. And I don't want to lose the narrative here that Sean Combs did commit acts of violence. His own counsel conceded that point. So for all these people going on TikTok and these hot takes saying, see, Diddy was innocent, he didn't do anything, completely disagree. Diddy was found legally not guilty of the charges brought against him because the government was not able to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt, and that the statutes that were available to them to prosecute were very limited. That's why we had the verdict that we had. And again, respect the verdict, understand the verdict, was not surprised by the verdict. But I think for people to go out and re-victimize these individuals and to say essentially nothing serious happened, I think is problematic. And I think it is furthering the problems that we have in this society where women are not believed, women are not encouraged to come forward in these cases. And then this verdict could potentially have an effect on future victims who won't trust the prosecution, won't put their necks out there. Because again, we're legal analysts. I'm a legal analyst. I understand that the sex trafficking statute was a stretch here, but there are other statutes that might be inside the statute of limitations for other victims that are a neater fit. And there is a stronger likelihood of a conviction and getting them justice. But they see a resolution like this and they say, I don't want to be humiliated for nothing. What's the purpose of this? And that's what victims ask whenever there's an acquittal. And I guess that's the major criticism to SDNY at this point, which is if you had these gaps in your evidence, why even put the victims through it? And I think that they really thought that they could win. Of course, they're incredible attorneys, but just really reevaluating all of this, I question the wisdom of going forward, even though I know they believed it was a righteous prosecution. So that's it. The trial is done. Diddy will serve no more than 5 years, I am almost fairly certain. But what do you think? Was it a true overcharge? Did the government overestimate their ability to present this evidence? Drop a comment. Tell me what you think.